In the darkest part of our psyches lies the potential for wickedness and cruelty. Most of us suppress this deep inner darkness. We choose the path of the civilized and the compassionate, the kind and the courteous. However, occasionally, the darkness deep inside of us erupts to the surface. In this podcast, I explore stories of darkness from history, myth, and legend. I am Dennis Sarah, and this is Evil. The man who has experienced shipwreck shudders even at a calm sea. Ovid, ancient Roman poet. Never in my life before have I experienced such beauty and fear at the same time. Ellen MacArthur, sailor. South England, May 1884. A 17-year-old orphan named Richard Parker did not have many career options in those days. England was entering its second industrial revolution, and working in a textile factory did not appeal to the young Parker. Instead, Richard opted to follow the great maritime tradition of the English and become a sailor. Now, if the name of an ocean-bound Richard Parker sounds familiar, you might be thinking of the Bengal tiger from the movie Life of Pi, directed by Ang Lee. The tiger's name was, in fact, Richard Parker. Life of Pi was based on a book of the same name, and the author named his shipwrecked tiger after a number of unfortunate Richard Parkers. All these Richard Parkers had maritime tragedies, including our young Richard Parker. Our story starts with the last voyage of the 16-meter English yacht, the Mignonette, and its crew of 4. The recent owner purchased the yacht with the idea of sailing it in the coastal waters of his homeland, Australia. The owner hired a 4-man crew, 32-year-old Tom Dudley as skipper, 37-year-old Edwin Stevens as first mate, 27-year-old Ned Brooks as crew, and 17-year-old Richard Parker as cabin boy. This was to be Parker's first ocean voyage. The yacht was to sail from Southampton, England, to Sydney, Australia. The inexperienced Parker must have been excited when he was hired as the cabin boy for the 24,000-kilometer voyage. I'm sure he saw the journey as a chance to gain valuable sailing experience he could parlay into a midshipman's position on another vessel, and perhaps the start of a long and adventurous career on the high seas. The future must have seemed epic to the young orphan. Of course, if Richard had been an experienced sailor, he might have passed on the long ocean cruise of the Mignonette. You see, the yacht was not an open ocean vessel. It was an inshore boat by design, and not made for the rigors of a long ocean journey. Even its lifeboat was a flimsy craft, as its walls were only 6 millimeters thick. There's no record about any concerns raised from the 3 experienced seamen, or how much they were paid. But they must have had apprehensions about the design of the yacht versus the open sea journey. Were they offered a generous amount to move the Mignonette to Australia? How much convincing did it take for Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks to take on this voyage? Perhaps it was nothing of the sort. Perhaps the 3 men were so confident with their skills and experience that they were sure they could get the yacht to Sydney. Regardless, the crew took the job, and the Mignonette and its 4 crew took off from Southampton, England, May 19th of 1884. The journey was to take the yacht south through the Atlantic, around the tip of South Africa, and then east to Australia. Unfortunately, the Mignonette met heavy weather in the South Atlantic 47 days into their journey. The type of weather the inshore boat was not made for. Dudley quickly realized the yacht had no real chance in the storm and was sinking quickly. The crew scrambled to free the lifeboat. Richard Parker was ordered to grab provisions from the galley below deck. Young Parker must have been in a grand panic. It was his first ocean trip, and the vessel he was so excited to board 47 days ago was taking on water and sinking into the Atlantic Ocean with no land in sight. Parker's panic of being below deck in a sinking yacht, in addition to his inexperience, is probably why he only managed to grab 2 tins of food before being forced to enter the lifeboat. It is reported that the Mignonette took only 5 minutes to sink. Not enough time for the young Parker to grab any proper rations. As he scrambled about, the rest of the crew managed to get the lifeboat free. When all 4 men made it off the yacht and aboard the lifeboat, it was discovered that Parker had gathered only minimal provisions. Richard Parker had only secured 2 tins of turnips and no fresh water. On July 5, 1884, the Mignonette sank into the Atlantic Ocean. Its 4 crewmen were watching helplessly from a flimsy dinghy with little food and no fresh water. He who lets the sea lull him into a sense of security is in very grave danger. Hammond and S., novelist. Until you have the courage to lose sight of the shore, you will not know the terror of being forever lost at sea. Charles Cook. The Mignonette's crew of 4 managed to board the lifeboat, hoist an oar in lieu of a mast, and attach shirts to act as a sail. With little provisions, no fresh water, and stuck in a flimsy lifeboat, the 4 set out to find land, estimated to be some 700 miles away. The Atlantic Ocean may be vast, but it's not empty. If you're lucky, food could be found. Fish, turtles, something. Of course, the ocean also has its own predators. With the storm past and the crew exhausted from trying to stay afloat, they finally slept that first night. Or so they hoped. In the middle of the night, a shark attacked the flimsy lifeboat. Desperate, the crew fought back with the oars. Reportedly, the shark attack took hours. Fortunately, no one was hurt. By morning, the shark had given up and swam away. July 7th, the second day on the lifeboat. The crew opens and shares the first 2 tins of turnips. They're only 2 days in, and they have eaten half their provisions. July 9th, the 4th day on the lifeboat. Fortune smiles on the hungry crew as they manage to capture a sea turtle. The animal is carved up, and each crew member receives about 3 pounds of fresh meat. The blood of the animal provides a small amount of drinkable liquid, as there's no source of fresh water other than the rain they catch in a cape. As they travel on, fresh water becomes a growing concern as little rain falls. July 13th, the 8th day on the lifeboat. With a shortage of fresh water, the crew is getting desperate and begins drinking their own urine. This supplements what little rainwater they catch in the Cape. July 16th, the 11th day on the lifeboat. With the sun beating down on them, little rain, and with a shortage of food, the crew shares its second and final tin of turnips. It's been 7 days since they caught any food, and 9 days since they opened the first tin of turnips. July 17th, the 12th day on the lifeboat. Dudley and Stevens proposed drawing lots in order to choose a victim who would sacrifice himself in order to save the rest. No decision is made, however, and the 4 suffer on. July 21st, the 16th day on the lifeboat. The last food the crew had was the final tin of turnips they shared 5 days ago. The debate about drawing lots to choose a sacrifice intensifies. Brooks refuses, and no resolution is agreed upon. The young and inexperienced Parker, desperate for water, drinks seawater. I'm sure the others warned him not to, but the desperation must have been too much for the young Parker. 16 days in the sun, very little water. Of course, the seawater makes him sick, and perhaps sealed his fate. July 23rd, the 18th day on the lifeboat. 7 days without any type of food, and very little rain for water. With Parker sick, and possibly in a coma, Dudley reiterates that it's better that one of them die, so that the other 3 may survive. However, Brooks still refuses. Later that night, Dudley again raises the matter. Stevens points out that Parker is probably dying anyway, that he and Dudley had wives and families, while Parker is an orphan. Again, the 3 cannot come to an agreement and leave the matter until the morning. July 24th, the 19th day on the lifeboat. With no prospect of rescue in sight, and 8 days of no food and minimal rainwater, Dudley and Stevens decide to act. There was no drawing of lots, no sacrificial lottery as proposed days before. Dudley and Stevens silently signaled at each other to sacrifice the 17-year-old Richard Parker. Brooks maintains he signaled no approval, nor did he protest. However, Dudley would later testify that Brooks had in fact signaled an approval. Dudley and Stevens knew that if Parker was dying, that killing him before his natural death would better preserve his blood for drinking. Stevens readied himself to hold the youth's legs, while Dudley said a prayer and pushed his penknife into Parker's jugular. Reportedly, as they were holding down Parker, he said, "What, me?" The 2 restrained Richard Parker as he tried to thrash about. Stevens and Dudley were careful to drain the blood from young Parker, and all 3 survivors shared in the drinking. Over the next few days, the 3, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks, ate of Parker's flesh and drank of his blood. July 29th, the 24th day in the lifeboat. 5 days after killing Richard Parker and tossing his head to the sea, the 3 survivors were spotted by the whaling ship Montezuma. After 24 days of being stranded in a lifeboat, and 5 days of surviving solely on the flesh and blood of young Parker, the crew was rescued. The rescuers must have come upon such a sight. The inside of the dinghy was littered with remains of Richard Parker. His blood stained the lifeboat and its crew. His flesh was laid in strips to dry out in the sun. Perhaps the 3 survivors owe Richard Parker extreme gratitude. Would they have survived without eating the young Parker? Did they exhibit any guilt or regret, any gratitude? According to Dudley's journal, he wrote, "On the 24th day, we were having our breakfast. A ship appeared at last." As we were having our breakfast, it almost sounds matter of fact. No other entry about how guilty they would feel. Once the Montezuma reached the port of Falmouth, Cornwall, they reported the incident to the authorities. As a result, Dudley and Stevens were charged and later convicted of murder. They were sentenced to the statutory death penalty with a recommendation for mercy. Afterwards, their penalty was reduced. The 2 men were released on May 20th of 1885. The case is often studied by law students, and many debates can be found online about the viability of survivorship. When questioned about the incident, all 3 men were candid. Dudley and Stevens believed they were protected by a custom of the sea. A custom of the sea is a custom that is said to be practiced by the officers and crew of ships and boats in the open sea. It is not like maritime law, which is a distinct and coherent body of law that governs maritime questions and offenses. No, this is more of an agreement practiced by those who are shipwrecked, survivors drawing lots to see who will be killed and eaten so that the others may survive. Dudley and Stevens believed they were protected by this. There's actually a grave marker for Richard Parker in Southampton, England. If you search online and look for it, the sacred memory of Richard Parker, age 17, who died at sea. No mention of how, but it does mention that cenotaph only, actual remains, are buried at sea. Thank you for listening to Evil Podcast. If you'd like to hear more episodes now and in the future, go to evilpodcast.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, go to patreon.com/evilpodcast. Every little bit helps, allows me to keep doing this podcast I love so much. Thank you.